Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I am very pleased to introduce our PRCPI's guest artist, the pianist Dr. Ana Maria Otamendi. Originally from Venezuela, she currently teaches at Louisiana State University as an assistant professor of collaborative piano. The artistic director of the Collaborative Piano Institute, Dr. Otamendi, founded the Elia Piano Duo and the Leveron Piano Trio, a Venezuelan ensemble devoted to the standard, modern, and Latin American piano trio repertoire. Before Dr. Otamendi became the head vocal coach of the Moores Opera Center at the University of Houston, she finished her 2-year tenure as studio artist at the Houston Grand Opera Studio, as well as the Marola Opera program of the San Francisco Opera. She also was head coach and conductor for the Franco-American Vocal Academy in France and Salzburg during several summers. Dr. Otamendi holds a master's degree in piano performance from the University of Wisconsin, and an artist certificate from the University of South Carolina, and a doctorate in collaborative piano from the University of Michigan. This year, she won the Emerging Artist Award from the University of Michigan as an artist who has greatly contributed to the profession. Dr. Otamendi has actively performed and lectured all over the world, like Austria, Panama, Brazil, Venezuela, the United States, Spain, Italy, Thailand, and Greece, like name a few. Today, she will give us a lecture discovering Latin American chamber music.
Thank you so much, Kuhn, for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be here today with you to talk about a subject that I'm very passionate about. I'm from Venezuela, so obviously I have an interest in Latin American music. And to be honest, the main reason is I think it's a really wonderful repertoire and not a lot of people know it. So I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation and to be joined by all these wonderful musicians. So before I begin, I shared a handout with Jessica, which will be distributed at the end of this session, sorry. But so that way you know that a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking about is going to be on that handout that you'll receive at the end. I wanted to show you briefly what's on that handout, and my email is in here, so if you all want to reach me. So first, some resources of which I'm going to be talking about at the beginning of the lecture. Then some selected works that are curated by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Horacio Contreras, a list of contemporary composers from Latin America, and then my own list of Latin American composers chronologically and by country. So you see it's quite a large list and has a lot of links about their websites, about some specific pieces that I think are great, sometimes places where you can find the scores. So you can go by country. And then finally, the list of videos I'm going to be sharing with you and my email at the end. So I hope you will find this useful if you like this repertoire and if you would like to program some of this in your own concerts or in the concerts of your students. Okay, so here we go. Let me share my screen here and share my PowerPoint. Actually, sorry, I should share my entire screen. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them on the chat. The lovely Stacy is going to be manning that for me and letting me know if there are any questions. So let us begin. We have been talking about diversity a lot in the last few years. It's been a hot topic, especially in the last year and a half. And I think diversity in music is a topic that has several branches, if you will. One of them is, of course, in order to have diversity, people need to have access to classical music, both in terms of listening to music, people that are in underprivileged economical situation to be able to go to concerts, to go to operas. This can be quite expensive. And of course, having access to lessons, music lessons, especially for those who cannot afford them, obviously, it's a big part of the issue why we don't have as much diversity as we would like to. Unfortunately, a lot of these populations tend to be populations of color. And I know there are some efforts being done here in the United States and in Europe about this, trying to make it more accessible to as many children as possible. Another part of representation of diversity is representation, both in faculty, in student body, government, artistic organizations, etc. And one other branch is just the knowledge of the repertoire. And it is in this branch that I would like to focus my presentation today, trying to offer to you guys a little sampler, a musical sampler, if you will, of really wonderful pieces by many different composers in Latin America, in the hopes that maybe you will feel like playing these or performing these or assigning them to your students. It's a beautiful repertoire, very rich in many, many different ways. So I'll talk a little bit about a few of these countries and the music from these countries and an overview of composers, and then I'll give you little musical samples. So, why is Latin American music great for all ages? I think, and I'm going to talk a little bit about vocal music, but mostly about chamber music in this presentation. First, melody. A lot of these pieces are based on folk melodies, folk tunes. There's two branches, and we'll talk about this. So, there's a good part of the output which is not nationalistic, but also has beautiful singable melodies that are very attractive to both audience and performers alike, no matter what the age is. In terms of rhythmic, they have a lot of rhythmic interest. They can be a good challenge if you have students and you want them to work a little bit on the rhythm in terms of pulse, but also in terms of a little more intricate rhythms that they're used to. Some of this music can be quite challenging. Also, if you yourself want to have a little challenge in some rhythms that you're not familiar with, this music is wonderful. Also, a lot of these rhythms are based on dances from a lot of these countries. Um, Obviously, this repertoire opens a window into cultural diversity, opens a window into the art and the culture and the world of these countries, which is so different from the more Eurocentric music making that we're used to. In terms of singing, the Spanish language is incredibly accessible for young singers. It has less vowels than Italian. It is very singable in terms that the language is very bright. So it's very conducive to great singing, just like Italian, but it's even more accessible. And I think it's a great first step for younger singers before they even sing in Italian to sing first in Spanish and create a great foundation. It's very lyrical. This music is incredibly lyrical, both for voice or piano or strings or wind instruments. I think in a way that is tied to the quality of the Spanish and the Portuguese languages. It's wonderful for legato. If you're a singer or you're a pianist and you're trying to work on your legato, I think music from every country is very much tied to the language of the composer who wrote that music. It doesn't matter if it's instrumental music. And in that regard, Spanish and Portuguese are very legato languages, like Italian, like French, and I think this is very much shown into the music. Now I'm going to say a few general considerations about this music. First of all, as I said, a lot of the rhythms are based on dances, on typical rhythms and dances for each one of these countries, which can be a challenge at the beginning, but at the same time, it's quite exciting when you find the root from a lot of this music, which I'll be pointing out in some of the examples that we're going to listen to, and how that applies to the actual performance of these pieces, is performance practice, if you will. So it's good to be aware of these when you're learning some of these pieces. As I said, a lot of them can be based on folk texts or folk melodies, folk poems of anonymous authors, if it's art song. There's this concept of mestizaje, which is the mixture of cultures. I think the way Latin America was colonized is very different from the United States, from North America, in the sense that the Spaniards and the Portuguese, they really mixed with the natives from the very beginning. So we ended up with a huge melting pot of races and a huge melting pot of cultures in South America. When you have, I'm from Venezuela, so you can find people that look very, 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 very white, and you have people that are very, 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 very dark, and everything in between. And it's not only that, it's a mix of religions. When the slaves came from Africa, they brought their religion with them. So this intermingled with Catholicism that the Spaniards brought and the original religion of the natives. And all of this, it mixed into a very, very interesting culture. And this is obviously reflected in the music. And then a lot of the composers that I'm going to be talking about, they fell into one of these two camps. The nationalistic camp that was a little bit later in South America than it was in Europe. But a lot of the composers, some of them for the whole career, some of them for part of their careers, expressed an interest in nationalism in music and how do I reflect who I am as an Argentine or as a Colombian or as a Venezuelan in the music that I'm writing. And then there was a universalistic trend in which composers were thinking, I don't want to go into that direction. I want to write music as more universal, sometimes influenced by what was happening in Europe, but sometimes it's trying to find a personal language. And I think composers like Ginastera, for instance, he had a little bit of both. He had periods who was very nationalistic and periods who was very non-nationalistic, much more avant-garde, and then periods that were a mix of the two. And this happened to a lot of the composers that we'll see today. So I want to talk a little bit about the handout that you guys are going to see and the things that you're going to find in them. So first, the resources. First, there's the Sphinx catalog of Latin American cello works. This is a really great initiative by two close colleagues, Dr. Horacio Contreras and Dr. Germán Marcano. They compiled an enormous list of works that include cello, by Latin American composers by genre. And a lot of these works include pianos. It's a really great resource if you're trying to find new music. It also tells you where you can find the music, if it has been recorded. So it's a wealth of information. You'll find the link in the handout. There's also the Sphinx catalog of Latin American piano trios. That is it's a new initiative by my piano trio, the Reveron Piano Trio, to catalog trios written in South America with the same idea, also sponsored by the Sphinx organization. Then there's the Latin American Art Song Alliance. It's a great site for Latin American art song. They really assist teachers and students of singing who are trying to access this repertoire, access the published, the publications, are trying to find the scores and provide them with tools to teach and perform it. So it's a really great resource. And you can actually buy some of the scores directly from their website. Then there's a Latin American Chamber Music Database. It's a research project by an Argentinian professor, Mariela Nedialkova, from the University of Universidad Nacional del Cuyo in Argentina, and includes a huge amount of chamber music, some of it with piano, some of it just for strings, also solo music for many instruments by composers from all over South America. So it's really quite a wonderful initiative, and she was kind enough to let me share this with you guys because it's something that she was doing for her university. Then I include in that handout selected a list of curated works for cello and piano that you can find the scores that are very beautiful, some are challenging, very challenging, but really beautiful. A list of contemporary composers, living composers from Latin America with their websites or their contact information. I know a lot of these people. They're really wonderful composers if you're looking to maybe commission some works, some new works by Latin American composers. This is it's not a comprehensive list by any means, but includes a lot of composers that I know, that I've played, that friends of mine have played, colleagues of mine have played, that are really quite wonderful. Some of them have won many awards. And then my list of Latin American composers, as I said, by country and chronological order. I already said that. so that's the handout that you're gonna see. So if you have any questions, my email is in that handout. I'm always happy to follow up with people if they have questions or if they're trying to find some of this music. Sometimes that's one of the biggest challenges I find for this repertoire is just finding the sheet music. So please feel free to contact me. Okay, so I'm gonna start in Brazil. And Brazil is a really interesting country. There's the idea of canção in Brazil. And a lot of this music and a lot of the vocal music that I have played from Brazil is very much based, canção means song. As I said, Brazil has a big influence of African, European, and Amerindian cultures, much more so than other countries in South America. Of course, they were colonized by the Portuguese. So a lot of this music is in Portuguese. They have a very, very rich music tradition that traces all the way back to the 16th century, some of it documented. There's not that many examples of the music previous to the colonialism, but still, as I was saying before, the African slaves introduced many of their customs, their languages, and their musical style into Brazil, and this was very much reflected by the music that these composers were writing. A lot of the music has very complex rhythmic structures. It has influence of drums and percussive speech patterns. I think the songs by Hernani Braga are a great example of that. They can be quite challenging to sing because you have a lot of words, some of them in Portuguese, some of them in almost gibberish because it's trying to imitate this percussive quality. But they're really beautiful, and they're usually a huge success with the audience, so those are really great. I think the 19th century Brazilian vocal literature, it was really influenced by bel canto. You can see this in the songs of Alberto Nepomuceno, for instance. Um, and as I said, they're very conducive to beautiful singing. They're very legato. They're very, very well written for the voice. And then there was a shift to nationalism. Brazil gained their independence in 1922, and after that, in a lot of Brazilian composers, there was this movement towards nationalism to try and to express the national of bringing Brazilian into their music. So here's some important Brazilian composers. A lot of these guys wrote art song and chamber music, so you're going to find more details about them in the handout that you're going to receive. So Claudio Santoro, Chiquinha Gonzaga, Alberto Nepomuceno, Heitor Villalobos, Luciano Galet, Jaime Ovalle, Francisco Mignone, Babi de Oliveira, Radamés Natali, Camargo Guarnieri, Osvaldo Lacerda, José Antonio de Almeida Prado, and Marcos Balter. Some of their music is available for purchase. Some of them is a little harder to find. Of course, probably the most well-known composer from this list would be Villalobos. However, most people really don't know his music except for maybe the Baquianas Brasileiras. So one of the first works that I performed with piano trio was the Villalobos piano trio, the first piano trio, and it's a work that's virtually unknown outside of Brazil, and I think even in Brazil not a lot of people play it, and it's quite beautiful. So I would love to share a little bit of this with you guys, so hopefully you can hear it. So here's a little bit of the Villalobos piano trio. So as you see, it's really quite beautiful music. It can be challenging to perform, but it's very rewarding. It's very beautiful. Sometimes Bielorussia writing in all three piano trios is a little, the texture is a little busy, so sometimes it's up to the performers to try to figure out who has the most important voice, because there's so much going on, and so many beautiful things happening in all three instruments at all times. But it's quite a wonderful trio, and as you see, it doesn't sound particularly Brazilian. So I think it's a good example of a composer that in other genres and in other, and this is quite early in his output, was much more overtly Brazilian. And this particular trio is very European. It sounds almost French sometimes. It has influence of some Spanish writing, but it's quite a beautiful piece. And he wrote three of them. The third trio is very experimental. It's a little bit more dissonant than the first and second piano trios. Also, Villalobos has some wonderful cello sonatas, very difficult violin sonatas as well, that nobody really performs, nobody really knows. So I would encourage you guys to discover some of this music. Other composers that wrote some fantastic chamber music, Claudio Santoro has piano quartets, piano trios, has string quartets with piano, as well as many, many songs. As I said, Nepomuceno has some pieces with instruments and piano, and Francisco Mignone has some shorter pieces and some pieces for viola and piano, and pieces for cello and piano. Camargo Guarnieri is another great example of a composer, Brazilian composer that has quite a bit of chamber music. Osvaldo Lacerda is very prolific composer, over 130 songs, and over 60 compositions for solo piano. So there's quite a big wealth of repertoire in Brazil. Sorry, I'm going a little fast, but I want to give you a little sampler from different countries. So next, I will go into Colombia. Colombia is a beautiful country with lots of contrast in terms of architecture, in terms of cultures. If you see the Andes, the people who live close to the Andes are so different from the people that live on the coast or the people that live on the capital. But there's lots of wonderful music from Colombia. Most of it is really not very well known. Here's a small sampler of composers from Colombia. I'm gonna give you some musical examples from Guillermo Uribe Holguín, which you see here. It's sort of on the earlier side, and also Antonio Maria Valencia, just to show you a little bit of a contrast between one composer that did not use a lot of nationalistic material, like Uribe Holguín, who was much more influenced by what was happening in Europe, who studied in France with Vincent Dandy, who studied with Eric Satie as well. And then somebody like Antonio Maria Valencia, which is much more, although he also studied in France and he also studied with Dandy, probably at the same time or close to Guillermo Uribe Holguín, but that's much more interested in how traditional Colombian music merged with these ideas that he learned in France and the things that were in vogue in Europe at the moment. So I'll play you a little bit of his Emociones Caucanas for piano trio. Each of these movements is based in different dances from Colombia, and compared with the violin sonata by Guillermo Uribe Holguín. So let me play first a little bit of the violin sonata. And you're gonna see it really sounds very, very French. It's beautiful, and luckily here we have the score. So I'm just going to play a little bit of the first movement. So as you see, it's very, very French. It could perfectly be written by a French composer, and as you see, a lot of his indications are written in French. So here's a great example of a Latin American composer that wasn't so interested in this idea of the nationalistic movement. At the same time as, oh, yes, is there a question, Stacey?
Yes, Dr. Otamendi, there's a question about where were these composers trained? Was it fashionable at the time for them to travel to Europe and study?
Yes, yes. Many of these composers, like Villalobos, trained in France. Guillermo Uribe Holguin studied with Vincent d'Indy. The next composer that, and they lived in France. A lot of them lived in France at the same time. The next composer, Antonio Maria Valencia, he, for instance, he studied with Manuel de Falla in Paris. He studied also with Vincent d'Indy. So many of these composers at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, went to study in Europe, especially those who were wealthy enough to be able to do that. But yes, very much so. Many of them were trained there, and you definitely see this. I think Enrique Soto is another great example. If I have time, he's from Chile. If I have time, I will play you a little bit of his violin sonata, because I think he's another great example of a composer that was trained over there, that very much carried all these influences from what was happening in France at that time, and then eventually was able to amalgamate these with very personal elements of themselves as South Americans. So yes. Any other questions? I see some things in the chat, but I haven't opened it.
Sergio wanted to let everybody know that he's published a book of music for flute and piano by Francisco Mignone, and he has the website, and we will post that and make sure that gets out there. Thank you so much, Sergio, for letting us know.
Yes, I just posted that in the Facebook chat.
Amazing, great. I'll make sure that I take a look at that. That's really exciting, Sergio. I know some of his music. I play some of his cello pieces, or cello and piano, and they're really beautiful. Something else that I usually tell my colleagues is a lot of this music that was, I mean, you could consider this sonata as a romantic sonata, for instance, a romantic violin sonata. And a lot of times we are looking for variety in the programming for ourselves or for our students, and say, well, I would like to have, a more romantic piece and then maybe a more modern piece. So you could easily substitute a French violin sonata for one of these violin sonatas that are written in similar times. Uribe Holguin was a little bit younger than Ravel, just about 5 years, so it's a little bit younger than Debussy. Or Enrique Soto was a contemporary of like the late Romantics, so it'd be very easy to substitute a traditional romantic piece for something that is also similar in style and similar in terms of time period, but from a completely different country. And I mean, really beautiful. This music is really, really gorgeous and very well written for both instruments. One of the reasons when I first started discovering this repertoire is like, how come nobody knows this? Some of them can be a little tricky to find. Like I'll say, Enrique Soto's music is a little tricky to find. You have to know some people in Chile, which is one of the other initiatives we're having with the trio, is to create editions of these pieces that can be you can purchase easily on the internet. That have made some critical editions, and that will be a great step in order for this music to be performed more often. Great. So continuing in Colombia, somebody's a little younger than Guillermo Uribe Holguin for a good 20 years is Antonio Maria Valencia. This is quite a beautiful recording by a very famous Colombian pianist named Blanca Uribe with her trio. So this is a complete recordings of Antonio Maria Valencia's works for piano and chamber music. So I'm going to play you a little bit of Emociones Caucanas, which is a piece in 4 movements that has, each one of the movements is based on different Colombian rhythms. And you're going to see now the big difference between the sonata we just heard and this piece that were written roughly in the same time. Antonio Maria Valencia was a virtuoso pianist. He was a conductor, he was a composer, he was a pedagogue. He was quite a musical figure in Colombia. And as I was saying, just as Guillermo Uribe Holguin, he was trained in France, studied with the same teacher. He studied piano, chamber music, composition, and he was very good about combining folk melodies and folk rhythms with impressionistic harmonies. So you're going to hear this in the Emociones Caucanas. And he wrote also a lot of songs. So I hope you like it. This is the second movement. This is very charming music. It's very beautiful. You probably noticed what I was talking about in terms of the more impressionist harmony sometimes, mixed obviously with this rhythm of a pasillo, which is the traditional Colombian rhythm. So let me go back to my presentation here. Oh, I thought I had a list of other, sorry, I think I left out a slide. So other important Colombian composers to pay attention to. There's Jaime León Ferro, who wrote really beautiful songs. Many of them. He was a great conductor and pianist and composer, and he wrote quite a big output of art song. They're some of them based in Colombian poetry, some of them based in poetry from all over South America. But the songs are very singable. They're very well written for both instruments, and they generally very well loved by audiences. So I think he's definitely a composer to listen for. There's of course Luis Carlos Figueroa, who was a student of Antonio Maria Valencia, and his music is also sort of post-impressionistic, lots of beautiful harmonic color, and also including Colombian rhythms. So he's another good composer that has a sonata for violin and piano, and he has songs, works for orchestra, and lots of works for cello and piano as well. Great, so now we're going to keep moving south into Argentina. Argentina has a huge list of important composers. A lot of these composers are influenced by the landscape of their country, and I think one of the regions that inspire the most Argentinian composers is the the Pampas. And you see this guy here is like a gaucho. It's a gaucho, which is the Argentinian version of a cowboy. This is a typical landscape of the Pampas when they have the mountains in the background and a vegetation that is very desert-like, where mostly cattle is raised, and it's huge extensions of land in the middle of the country. So it's a province in the center of a huge line of river, a very large region. Then the name derives from the Pampa Indians. That's where the name comes from. So probably talking about Argentina, the most famous composer that comes to mind is, of course, Alberto Ginastera. He was a huge figure in South American music, really, not just in Argentina. He was a big force of nature, and he was very well known. He wrote a lot of large-scale works, which I think gave his output a much bigger diffusion than other composers like Guastavino, for instance, who was equally prolific, if not more, but it was devoted to smaller genres like art song and shorter piano pieces, whereas Ginastera was writing operas and symphonies and big orchestral works and choral works. Also wrote lots of beautiful songs, and he has a good amount of chamber music. So his most well-known works for chamber music are the two Pampeanas. Mostly the Pampeano number 2 is the one that most people play. There's a sonata for cello and piano, is also quite beautiful. It's difficult. It's on the later side of his output. And he has a piano quintet. And then he has some duos for woodwind instruments. And that, together with his songs, it's probably the most prominent of his chamber music. Alberto Ginastera was, as I said, at the forefront of what was happening in Latin America, and he influenced most of the composers of his time and that came after him. He won a Guggenheim Fellowship to come to the United States and to study, and he had a very active role as a pedagogue, and also politically he was very, very involved in what's happening with Perón in Argentina at the time. So I'm not going to play some of his music because I think he's one of the most well-known composers. I did want to mention him because I think it'll be strange to have a lecture on Latin American music and not mention him. However, but he talks a little bit about how the Pampas inspire him. However, the list of Argentinian composers is very, very long. So here's just a few of them. Probably from this list, Carlos López Buchardo it's a famous name. He influenced many of the composers that came after him. Is a big influence in Guastavino, for instance, and also in Ginasteras. And then it's Carlos Guastavino, who wrote over 600 songs, which seems really crazy, yet most people either don't know him or know just one or two songs like La Rosa y el Sauce, which is a beautiful song, but he wrote so many more. I think Guastavino is a great example also of a composer that was very non-nationalistic towards the beginning is much more influenced by European music, and then towards in the second part of his output, he's much more influenced by the nationalism and how to depict Argentina and the Argentinian rhythms and dances and folk melodies in his music. As I said, he wasn't as well known as Ginastera, probably because he was a very private person and writing in much more smaller scale. Also because he was considered a little bit of a retrograde, if you will, compared to Ginastera. And while Ginastera was writing very dissonant music and very atonal, being very avant-garde, Guastavino remained tonal throughout his output, and you see he just died in 1995, so pretty recently. So for a lot of people, he was too old-fashioned, he was too old school. Similar thing that happens to Rachmaninoff with some people who thinks he was old-fashioned just because he was alive at the same time as Schoenberg and Ravel, and his music was much more romantically oriented, but I don't think that in any way takes away from the quality of the music, and I think Guastavino is a great example of the same thing. And we continue going chronologically, so as you see, of course, Astor Piazzolla, it's a name that also pops in here. Probably his most famous chamber work is Le Gran Tango, which is the one that most people play. There's a great arrangement of his Four Seasons of Buenos Aires for piano trio that is very effective. We made very minor changes. And there's lots of arrangements of his tangos for all sorts of chamber combinations. And probably on the forefront is Eduardo Alonso Crespo and Esteban Bensecri, both really good contemporary composers. They're both very open to people contacting them about their music. They are very interested in people playing their music, and I think Alonso Crespo is a little bit more influenced by Argentinian culture and the traditional music, especially tango. Bensecri is a little bit more avant-garde, a little more contemporary, but they're both very interesting composers, very nice people. So in order to give you a little taste of this more recent compositions, I'm going to play you a little bit of the Eduardo Alonso Crespo piano trio, which you're going to notice, although the beginning is not very tango-like, it does develop into it. So I just play a little bit of this. So it's a piece is in about 4 different sections, but you obviously can hear the tango influence in it. But it's very well written, and as I said, he's very interested in people playing his compositions, even sometimes offering his music for free. And he's very, very nice and very good musician, so I really like his music. Um, Moving on, in Argentina, there's other very, very important composers like Alberto Williams, for instance, who has 3 sonatas for violin and piano that are very difficult. His music is very virtuosic, well written, but very quite difficult, very Lisztian, I think, in nature. There's Julián Aguirre, who was one of the most important Argentinian composers of his generation, that together with Alberto Williams started the folkloric movement in Argentina and stepped away from the influence of Wagner and Verismo, and then sort of replaced and remained influenced by Spanish music. Julián Aguirre wrote over 60 pieces for solo piano, has lots of chamber works that are really, really beautiful. As I said, there's Carlos López Buchardo, who's also has quite a bit of chamber music. Julio Perceval is a little more eclectic, influenced by Lesis and Stravinsky, and as I said, Guastavino. So Argentina really has a big, big wealth of chamber music and art songs, so that I very much recommend that you guys check out.
Dr. Otamendi, we had a question in the chat. Are there resources as well for piano duos in any of the literature that you have come across?
Like 2 pianos or 4 hands?
Yes.
There are some. To be completely honest, I don't know a lot about 4 hands, and 2 pianos not an area that I have been really putting a lot of emphasis on. But there is certainly music written for 4 hands, especially in the 19th century and then towards the beginning of the 20th century. But that's definitely something I can look into if somebody's particularly interested in that area. My email is in the handout, so feel free to email me, and I can probably put you in touch with somebody who does. I have 2 colleagues in Venezuela that specialize, especially in 4-hand repertoire. And
that would be
they
wonderful.
a lot of repertoire, so I'd be happy to put you in touch with them. Juan Francisco Sanz and Maria Antonia Sanz Palacios. They have a duo, a very active 4-hand duo, so I'm sure they'll be able to tell you a lot more about that than I can, but I'll happily put you in touch.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so I left Venezuela for last because it's a V and because I'm from Venezuela. So I'm gonna give you a little sampler of music from Venezuela, one by a female composer, Modesta Bor, who I absolutely love, and another one by a more recent composer, a brilliant living composer named Paul de Sen, he's probably the one I would say, together with Ricardo Lorenz and Alfredo Rugeles, that have wrote the most for piano and other instruments. So I'll give you a little sampler of that. As I said, Venezuela, it has a very similar influence of the African culture and the Spanish culture in its music and in our culture, our traditions, and this is very much reflected in the music of both of the composers that I will show you, and also of many of the composers that I wrote in my handout of resources. Here's a list of important Venezuelan composers. I think Juan Bautista Plaza was probably the father of Venezuelan classical music together with Antonio Esteves. They were both major pedagogical and compositional figures in Venezuela who trained the following generations of classical musicians. Juan Bautista Plaza has a lovely set of songs, of 7 art songs called Siete Canciones Venezolanas. It's just a little bit of paying homage to Falla Siete Canciones Populares Españolas, based some of them in folk rhythms like joropo and bambuco and pasillo, and very beautiful, very singable, also based on nature in the Venezuelan plains. Antonio Esteves was also a major, he was a conductor, he was a professor, he was a very renowned composer. And then it's Modesta Bor, who was also trained in the Soviet Union. She was a student of Aram Khachaturian, and her music has this wonderful influence of more Russian music, European music, jazz, and Venezuelan rhythms and dances. So it's very rich and very beautiful. Has a lot of music for solo piano as well. Alfredo Rugeles, who is an amazing conductor, but also a wonderful composer from all sorts of genres. Then Paul Descent, who I will be playing one of his pieces for violin and piano. And Ricardo Lorenz, who is actually a professor here in the United States. He's a professor in Michigan State. Really great composer. His music it's accessible. It's difficult, but very accessible in the sense of it's not hard to listen, and but it's very rich and complex at the same time. I really admire him. I really love his music. So just before I go into the last musical examples, I want to mention quickly some of the countries I didn't get a chance to feature in this presentation. Manuel Ponce from Mexico is one of the most well-known composers. He wrote many songs that are absolutely beautiful. His piano trio is fantastic. You can find it actually on IMSLP. He was quite a good pianist and wrote also lots of music for strings, mostly well known for his Estrellita that Heifetz made very popular, but has lots of great chamber music. Silvestre Revueltas, of course, much more well known for his orchestral music, especially Sensei Maya. Carlos Chavez, same, a very great exponent of Mexican music. And then for Puerto Rico, have Ernesto Cordero and Rafaela Ponte Lede and Carlos Vasquez. Oh, sorry. From Cuba, Eduardo Sanchez de Fuentes and Gisela Hernandez, and there's more composers from all of these countries in the handout. Chile, Pedro Humberto Allende, Juan Orrego Salas, and Eduardo Soro, which I didn't include here, and Teodoro Barcárcel, Edgar Barcárcel, Alfonso Brocqua, and Felix Eduardo Fabini. So there's quite a big wealth of wonderful music from Latin America that most of us really don't know very well. So, since we're nearing the end of our presentation, let me share with you a little bit of Paul Descent and Modesta Bor. Let me start with Modesta Bor. This is a little bit of her suite for cello and piano. This movement, the Andante Espressivo, is based on an habanera rhythm. Also has an influence of Venezuelan bambuco, which is slightly different from the Colombian bambuco. But it's a beautiful dance. It's still danced in several parts of Colombia and Venezuela. So this first movement it's influenced by both of these.
Nos vamos de vacaciones con toda la familia.
I thought I had ran the ads ahead of time, but I guess not. as you see, it's a very personal language. You certainly can hear some of the influence of Venezuelan music and some of the influence of the habanera, although it's very veiled, and at the same time a very personal conception of harmony that I think is influenced by his work with Khachaturian, but also with Bautista Plaza and Esteves. So I love her because I think her style is very unique. Her songs are absolutely beautiful. Some of them, like Coplas Venezolanas, is based on Venezuelan rhythms, and some of them are very jazzy, actually. So I very much recommend her music. She has 4 fugues for solo piano that are really great. So yeah, she's one of my favorite Venezuelan composers. And then just to leave you with something a little bit more upbeat, there's Paul de Sen, who is a very emblematic composer. He still lives in Venezuela, but he has a huge output of music, of which some of it includes like pieces for cello and piano called Piazzo Laberintus, and sonatas for flute and piano. They're available online. I included some of this information in the handout. He has a trio for clarinet, cello, and piano. So he has quite a bit of music for solo piano, and also quite a bit of music of art song. So I'll leave you here with a little bit of the Suite Venezolana by Paul de Sen, and that this first movement, it's called El Totunel de Guarenas, which is an area of Caracas. I hope you enjoy. So that's all I have for you guys today. I hope after this presentation, some of you will be inspired to look for some of this music and to perform it. Is very rewarding. I think you see what I said about the rhythms. It's not easy. It can be very challenging sometimes, but it's definitely worth it. And not all of the music is complicated rhythmically. I think Paul de Sen's music in particular can be quite complex, but quite beautiful. So anyway, thank you so much, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you so much. And I put the link to your handout here in the chat. So we will definitely be using that. I really appreciate that. And I'll just encourage everyone. We've got a 3 p.m. panel starting here with Dr. Anatolia Ioannidis. So feel free to join us there. We're going to cut the live stream real quick so that they can start to broadcast. But I see, Sergio, you have a question?
Yeah, Jessica, I love very much your presentation, Dr. Otamendi. It
Thank
was
you.
really great, and I enjoy very much in getting to know some of the composers from Venezuela and Colombia that I didn't know about, and it's very good. And I congratulate you for the presentation, but I would like to make more advertising. We have here in Brazil a service that's free
Yes.
for scores. In Brazil, we have this social service from the commerce. It's like a kind of organization from the, and they do a lot of cultural things, and they did this marvelous website with scores you can search for, and it's I'm gonna put the link here in the
Yes, please. That's amazing. Thank you.
and you can go there, and most of the works are either didn't have rights because it's, but some composer they give the permission to use the music, so you can
Amazing.
have a lot of it's a good resource now that we do everything online, and
Absolutely. Thank you.
we are glad that we have Sesc. Sesc is the main mentor for this. They have the resources, and some of my colleagues work there, and I collaborate with them. And even the site you can look in English and Spanish also. So it's a good tool for whoever is looking for some Brazilian music. You cannot have everything there. It's a lot, and so, but you can have a good part of it.
Of course. Would you be willing to share your email with me? Because we're still
Sure.
in the catalog and so any contacts we can have in
Uh,
other countries are very much appreciated.
I'm gonna put my email here.
The chat, yes, that'll be lovely.
Whoever wants to contact me, no problem. And I put a comment before. I published a book from flute music by
Francisco Mignone.
Francisco Mignone. It's very good music.
Yeah.
It's part of my research, my life research, and
Wonderful.
I got this grant to pay the rights for the widow. She wants because everything was on manuscript, but she needs to have some compensation to make it published. So the whoever wants to order it, just tell me. I have a copy here, and it was published in 2016, and you have the piano part, the flute part, and it's 13 works. Half of it I made an arrangement for guitar, so it can be played by flute and guitar or flute and piano. So
do you
it's
find that they could be
advertising.
Do you find that they could be played by violin as well? A lot of
yes, yeah. Some of the music, at least one or two, I kind of transcribe it
from violin. Okay, yeah.
From violin to the flute, so it can go either way. No
Great.
problem.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you very much. It's good to get to know you.
Yeah, likewise. Very nice to meet you.
Well, thank you all so much. I'm glad we can make these connections. Thank you, Dr. Otamendi, for sharing all that knowledge and that resource with us. And to Sergio, yeah, wonderful. Good luck with the rest of your festival too.
Thank you. Almost there. Good luck luck to you
All right.
guys too. I wish I could be coming to more sessions, but with
That's
CPR,
okay. Well, it's okay.
but I'll make sure I catch them later. So
Well,
thank you.
and she'll be joining us on our panel tomorrow to discuss
Yes.
collaborative piano issues. So you can see her again and ask more questions. So thank
For sure.
you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.